Today we look at NBA player whose talents for one reason or another have seemingly vanished. Players that used to be among some of the best in the NBA, but now most are just role players. Let's look at 13 guys and try to find out what happened with them. Starting first with Dwight Howard. This one's an old one, so we'll keep it short and sweet. Dwight Howard put together a Hall of Fame career in Orlando, then quickly fell off. In large part because of the way the game changed and he really didn't fit in as well anymore. Which is why in recent years we've only been able to find him at the end of most teams' benches. Then there's Griffin, and he was a weird one because we saw him as a star on the Clippers. He moved over to the Pistons and had one of the best years of his career. Then at 30 years old had knee surgery in 2019, had another knee surgery in 2021, and at 32 years old he returned and was averaging 12 points and 5 rebounds a game, after he had just averaged a career high 25 points a game 2 years prior. A lot of people thought he was just playing really bad on purpose to get the Pistons to trade him, because after being known for dunking his whole career, he went like 2 entire seasons in Detroit without a single dunk. So then eventually he does get traded to the Brooklyn Nets, but ends up coming off the bench for them these past 2 seasons, and most recently played limited minutes, averaging only 6, 4, and 1 last year in what still should have been his prime. At 32, it's still really early for a player to just fall off like that, and recently it seemed like Griffin's talent and athleticism has just straight up vanished. Last year he even signed for the veteran minimum, and at the time it just looked like he was taking a pay cut to win a championship, but now that it's pretty late into the offseason and he still hasn't been picked up by any team, probably means there's no coming back for him. I guess looking back we'd have to point out his knee surgeries as the reason that he hasn't been himself, but it's just weird because plenty of players have had that same surgery and haven't really been affected by it. Now, an obvious person I had to include on this list was Markelle Fultz, because he's had the biggest case of all time of a player's talent just straight up vanishing. Sure, it was because of an apparent shoulder injury, but even still to this day there's a lot of things about that story that just don't make any sense. I did a video on it a while back, and apparently it was some injury that baseball players usually get from throwing the ball too much, and it can cause them to have to relearn to throw, which does make a lot of sense when put into Markelle's scenario and why he completely forgot how to shoot. But it's just insane to think back about a dude that deserved and did go first overall, got a career ruining injury just completely randomly, and has never played the same again and probably never will. This next one's a little more situational, but I think it's safe to say that Julius Randle's talent vanished in the 2021 playoffs. It was just weird because in 2020 the Knicks finished with a terrible record. Then in 2021 he leads them to the playoffs, makes the All-Star team, wins the Most Improved Player award, and averaged 24 and 10. But then the playoffs come around, and it was his first time ever playing in the postseason, and the Knicks weren't even playing anyone too impressive. They were playing the Hawks, and he just fell apart, putting up okay stats but on terrible shooting numbers, and every time he touched the ball it was bad, so the Knicks only won 1 game. But then this past year was a step in the wrong direction for him too. Listen, he's still a good player, I'm just saying he fell off in the postseason, and let's just hope he's not going to be like Toronto Raptors DeMar DeRozan that was just incapable of playing when it mattered most. And that leads us perfectly into him, who I wanted to talk about next, because the disappearing act DeRozan put on every single postseason was something historically bad, and it even started in his very first playoff game and continues still to this day, which has given him the worst plus minus in NBA history at minus 371. In his very first playoff game he finished 3 of 13 from the field, missing his first 8 shots, and now most recently in his very first playoff game for the Bulls against the Bucks this year he finished 6 of 25 and scored 18 points in 43 minutes played. I've never really been too sure of why his playoff curse exists. I don't know if it's just that his game doesn't fully translate or it's just nerves that don't let him play like himself, but his playoff curse was the worst on the Raptors because he would have multiple games where he wouldn't hit a single shot and would finish with 0 points or something along those lines. It's why the Raptors would always be one of, if not the best team in the regular season, but then usually wind up out in the first round, which is why DeMar is 2-9 overall in game 1. And DeMar couldn't just do that alone, and he didn't, because Kyle Lowry had that same exact problem. And for your 2 superstars to be known for vanishing when the playoffs start is why the entire Toronto Raptors are 2-15 all time in game 1s. It was really kind of a worst case scenario for them. He also had multiple games for them where he'd play 30 plus minutes and just straight up record 0 points. And just like DeMar, his problem still exists to this day. 2 years ago, Lowry averaged 17 and 5 in the postseason. This season with Miami, he put up 7, 3, and 3 on 29% from the field and 24% from 3, which included game 5 against the Celtics, where Kyle put up 0 points, 0 rebounds, and 1 assist in 25 minutes on the court. I mean, you'd think by now with him having won a championship and all, that this wouldn't happen anymore, but it's followed him his entire career and will continue to even next year. Carmelo Anthony's talent also vanished a few years back, or at least it seemed like it if you ask anyone involved with the NBA. Now today, obviously Melo's 37, so he's not going to play the same as prime Melo did, but we all remember a few years back when no one wanted him. He even signed a 10-day with the Rockets and they just chose not to renew it. I get this was more of a scenario of him not fitting in anywhere and teams not liking his attitude, so they just didn't want him, but for a bit there it also seemed like he just wasn't the same player anymore. I'm still not really sure what happened to Kevin Love and his talents in the NBA. For the Minnesota Timberwolves, he was a monster and averaged 26 and 13 in his best season, but ever since being on the Cavs, he's just been a different dude. And sure, there's the argument that it was because he was the third option and fell off in a similar fashion to what happened to Chris Bosh when he was the third man man on a LeBron super team, but I don't think that same argument works, because Bosh wasn't a stretch 4 at the time. He couldn't stretch out to the 3 when he first joined Miami, and the fact that Kevin could meant that he should have been the perfect third option. He should have been there to get open shots and rebound all night long. Plus, Bosh's stats really didn't fall off nearly as bad as Love's did. And even once Kyrie left the team, Kevin wasn't better, and once LeBron left too, we still never saw him go back to his old self. So it's really up for a debate why Kevin had such a big drop off, but I guess my best bet would be that he was only so good because he was on a terrible Wolves team for years, and that probably got him a little overrated. And then when he was actually on a contender, he played like he was really supposed to. Now, I was a little hesitant, but I'm gonna go ahead now and throw James Harden on this list too, because ever since leaving the Houston Rockets, Harden hasn't been the same guy. When he got to the Brooklyn Nets and started averaging far less points, it was easy to say that it was just because he was being more of a playmaker and playing with 2 other superstars, and he even played point guard for a while and it seemed to work. So for the past 2 years, he kind of had an excuse for his numbers dropping, from him averaging 34 points a game on the Rockets to 24 a game the very next season. And he wasn't playing as aggressive and wasn't drawing fouls like he used to. He was really playing like a different player, but it was really nothing to complain about since people called him out for that exact style for years. So it was nice to finally see him switch things up on the Nets. But now, after joining the 76ers, well, his play kind of downgraded again. Listen, I think on this Philly team with Joel Embiid, they need James to be exactly the guy he was in Houston, and their whole system should revolve around him. But after this past postseason, I'm thinking that he just can't anymore. And it doesn't make sense. He's still in his prime as a player at 32 years old. But he played in an elimination game, took 2 shots in the second half, and said it was just because the ball never got back to him. Then got called out by Joel for not being the same player anymore. So something really did happen to his talent, his mentality, and his scoring ability. I'm just not too sure what it was. Hopefully though, next season we can see his old self come back. As for Draymond Green, I mean, in the Warriors 73-9 year, he put up a career high 14 a game. And at the time, I thought it was only going up from there. I could see him as a 16 or 17 point per game scorer in the future, but instead it's only been downhill, to the point now where he's only putting up around 7 a game these days. And listen, he's admitted that he purposely doesn't shoot anymore, so the fact that his scoring ability has just completely vanished has been done intentionally by him, and a lot of people don't agree with it. He says, why would I score when I can get 2 of the best shooters of all time open looks? But a lot of times he doesn't, and for the majority of the game, whenever he touches the ball, there isn't a defender within 10 feet of him. He won a championship, so we can't complain. His philosophy actually worked. All I'm saying though is I think he at least deserved to mention in this video. Now, as we all know, in a way, Isaiah Thomas's NBA talents vanished after the Boston Celtics, and of course it was because of his hip injury. He said that he had been playing through an injured hip, and it was why he suffered on the Cavs, the Lakers, and eventually fell off completely, going from an MVP candidate and superstar for the Celtics to out of the league with just a couple years later. And I'll give him that. Obviously he's not going to be himself while fighting through injuries, especially when the Celtics were lying to him about it. But what still gets him included in this list is that he's had a few different surgeries, years to recover, and has publicly come out and said that all of his injuries are fixed and he's finally back to 100%, but then still comes out and plays like a shell of his former self. Since making that remark in 2019, he's played for 5 different NBA teams on 4 different 10 days, and the Wizards even giving him a chance to prove himself as a starter, and he only averaged 12 and 3. And ever since that starting role, he's barely ever started another one. The whole Celtics trade really threw him off track, and he's never been able to recover it, and probably never will. Now, Serge Ibaka's kind of a weird one, because coming into the league, he was more of a traditional big man. Played down low, blocked shots, and could stretch the floor a little bit, but nothing crazy. Then once the game started to change, he was one of the few guys that changed with it and developed an outside shot so he could start playing at the 3-point line. Overall, I'd say his best days were in OKC when he was that pure shot blocker, but then he got traded to the Raptors, and he spent a few years there as a stretch center, and even though he didn't block shots anymore, he still averaged a career high in points in 2020. But it was just weird because I don't know what happened to him. In 2021, he got traded to the Clippers, and his averages dropped to 11 points and 6 rebounds a game. He was completely out of their rotation come playoff time, and last year in the regular season, he was moved to the bench, was then traded to the Bucks, and at 32 years old, pretty much found himself completely out of their rotation, and just signed with them on a minimum contract. How did he go from averaging career highs 2 years ago to getting a minimum deal? Honestly, I don't know what happened to Serge, and it's just been a little weird. Andre Drummond's in his athletic prime right now at 28 years old, but ever since getting traded from the Pistons, he's fallen off too, and it's clear he's always just played in the wrong era. He would have fit perfectly 20 years ago as a guy that could still average 15 points and 15 rebounds every single night. But even when he was a star in Detroit, that was starting to get old, and he really wasn't helping the team with his play style. And ever since they traded him, he's just slowly bounced around from team to team. He's played for 4 different teams since then, having just signed a minimum deal last year, and pretty much the same thing this year for the Chicago Bulls. I don't necessarily think his talent did vanish, but the league kind of pushed him out to make it seem like it. Then finally, there's Victor Oladipo. We all know he was turning into a star for the Pacers. He completely changed the team, became an all-star, and led them to the playoffs when it looked like they were about to start rebuilding. And he was on that path for a bit, but then a ruptured right quad really took that away from him, and it had been bothering him for these past couple of years. Apparently though, it was finally fixed this past season, season. So 2022 should be a big year for him, but we're just gonna have to wait and see whether he goes back to being a 20-point per game scorer or that almost 3-year-long injury really caused his talents to vanish. If you enjoyed, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'm out.